Hello, friends,
Welcome to the Liberation Chronicles. I'm Robin Parker.
and I'm Jorge Ceballos. This is a special episode of the Liberation Chronicles on ICE and the Latino community. Today, we're each going to first have an overview of the impacts of the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement on Latinos. We'll be doing that in two ways. First, Robin will give an overview of the social and economic impacts of the Trump administration's use of ICE on Latinos. Second, I'll offer a personal perspective on the surge in ICE enforcement on my own life and the lives of Latino friends and colleagues.
Immigration and Custom Enforcement is an agency of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act provides ICE with $75 billion for enforcement and hiring, which is triple the prior year budget. The workforce has more than doubled, and ICE has drastically increased its capacity for detention and mass deportation, buying up warehouses, I would note, across the country. And this is at a time when the overall federal workforce shrank by 10% as a result of Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency and a surge in voluntary resignations. There has been a surge in detentions and deportations that has especially hit Latinos, with the administration's stated goal of 1 million deportations per year. This government effort in mass deportation is based on a narrative that so-called illegal immigrants are spoiling the U.S. economy and subjecting the populace to criminal activity, and therefore it's important to remove criminals from U.S. cities. A UCLA study found ICE detention of immigrants with no criminal convictions recently tripled, with longer detentions and more frequent facility transfers. Other data shows that about 90% of the street arrests of immigrants without a criminal history were Latinos. Analysts and civil rights advocates report that the use of racial profiling, that is, stopping people who appear to be Latinos, significantly affects everyday life for Latino communities, increasing fear of routine activities like calling the police or speaking Spanish publicly. So, we have a heavily armed police force, recently more than doubled in staff size to more than 22,000 officers and agents, prowling American streets in search of mostly Latinos who have violated our immigration laws. And by the way, it is a misdemeanor to unlawfully enter the country as a first offense. And it is only a civil infraction, not a crime, to outstay your legal entry. There is no economic advantage from the action of removal and deportation. As we've explained before, the removal of immigrants hurts our economy. It doesn't make it stronger, and it doesn't rob U.S. citizens of jobs. But I really want to talk about the moral problem that is embedded in all of this, and that's what's worse. ICE raids are morally wrong because they intentionally cause widespread harm to innocent people as a means of enforcing mostly administrative laws. The raids don't just affect the person being detained. They traumatize children who are often U.S. citizens. They destabilize families. They terrorize entire neighborhoods. And they harm people who have committed no wrongdoing at all. Also remember that immigration offenses are not violent crimes, and sometimes not crimes at all. Yet ICE operations often involve armed agents, forced entry, public humiliation, and detention that may include abuse or neglect. I believe that's not justice, it's overreach. Certainly, the raids are a deterrent, but remember that deterrence that functions through fear without fairness and due process is inherently immoral. That's why civilized people reject torture and terrorism as means to deterrence. They are certainly effective, but not what we'd want to have in our society. So, Jorge, we know that ICE raids affect not only the persons targeted, but the wider community, especially Latinos. In light of the unique historical moment that we're in right now, targeting Latinos, what are your reflections?
Yeah, thank you, Robin. I want to start my reflections on the story of this little boy that you all see on the screen, Liam Conejo Ramos. And that picture of Liam is when ICE actually took him to use as bait to get his family to open up the door to their home so they could arrest his father. And eventually they gathered both of them and sent them to an ICE detention center. There's so much around that particular story that, we can go into, but I don't want to spend too much time talking about all the specifics of Liam's experience, but just start from a point of when that picture was published, how it landed on me. And it was a moment, it was an image, it was what's being depicted here. Looking at his expression, that picture broke me. And for days, I could not shake off that image of that little boy looking so sad and so innocent. He's 5 years old. And the brutality and inhumanity of ICE showed up in this particular moment in the way they treated this little boy. And it's not my experience. I as you know, was born in the United States. My parents were living here as immigrants with a work permit. They were not here illegally, but I was born here. So for a long time, I never felt the fear of deportation because I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm a U.S. citizen. But I could recognize myself in that little boy because of the way he looks. And I saw myself in him. Now here's the interesting thing again. So, you know, when it comes to issues of immigration and deportation and before what we're experiencing now with ICE and the raids that are going on across the country, um, I knew that it was an experience that happened to folks that looked like me, but I never felt like I would become a target. But for the first time, because of the way they're going about it now, I felt the proximity of the administration's desire to grab as many people that looked like me and put them through a process of deportation. So back in June of last year, I had to go to Mexico on a business trip. I had to go and facilitate a gender equity session for a company down in Mexico. I have my passport. It's current, has not expired. But I also remember reading stories about citizens that were being pulled aside and sometimes put in detention for a day or two, maybe a couple of cases even longer. And US citizens coming back from trips abroad and then being pulled for questioning. So for the first time, that trip that in the past wouldn't have meant anything but just an interesting opportunity to go out of the country felt like I needed to put things in place in case I was pulled aside and maybe even my citizenship would be in question. So I let people know next to me, my daughters, my sisters. I let them know when I was leaving. I shared my itinerary. Um, I told them that I would let them know when I landed back in the United States, so they know that I'm already here in the country. And in case they don't hear from me after that, that they should be concerned. I gave them a few numbers to contact. I gave them some ideas of how they might go about trying to figure out where I was and who to lean on for support in a situation like that. Nothing happened. Fortunately, I was able to come back into the country. I was not pulled aside for questioning. But again, for the first time, I felt like I could not just leave without planning ahead in case, because it didn't feel so far fetched that that might be something that could happen to me. As a matter of fact, interestingly enough, this is many, many years before I was on another trip to Cuba. We went with a delegation from a university where I was working at the time to study the possibility of doing a study abroad in Cuba. So on the way back, I was actually pulled aside, put into this room where they don't tell you anything. They just make you sit there until someone calls you for questioning. I lost my connecting flight back home. Um, they didn't care, obviously. The reason that I was explaining why I was pulled aside because they were looking for someone with the same name that was supposedly a drug dealer. Um, I can't tell if that was true or not, but I for a moment, I got to experience what it's like to actually have your citizenship, your legality questioned, and what might happen to you. Right. So now here I am in 2025 with the actual examples of many people experiencing that, and I felt like, well, that could be me.
Hmm.
That could be me. I've never felt that sense of insecurity. For the first time, I felt it then. Right. So this whole moment in another time, it still would be something that I'd be very concerned about because of the level of inhumanity, but it never felt like it was personal in a way that I could be one of those people. Today, um, I am 100% convinced that I could be. That luckily in my area, there haven't been raids like the raids in Minnesota, but we have had raids not that far from me in Charlotte, which is a city south of me, about an hour and a half south of me. So nearby, at some point it might come into our area, and I may be walking down the street looking like I do, maybe speaking to someone in Spanish, and I become a target. And I don't have my passport with me because I don't carry it with me every day. That's not a necessity in this country. But now they're making it a necessity. Right? So anyway, it's turned extremely personal, and that fear of what might happen, even the way that I came into citizenship, seems to now be in question because I am a child of immigrant parents, right? So that process of how I obtained my citizenship might actually be in question. They are talking about uh, uh, removing citizenship from folks that they feel unworthy of having received that honor. And who knows? I could be one, right? I could be one. As many of you know, I was basically fired from a job I had because I protested against Trump, um, which is probably somewhere accessible for folks if they want to do a deep dive into my background. So I may become one of those folks that because of the way I obtained my citizenship and my further activities as an anti-Trump activist, I may be deemed not worthy of retaining my citizenship. So again, it's just in a very strange and unexpected way. All of a sudden, this is not just something that I am concerned about because of my values. I am concerned about from a very personal place. Um, and then, I have to think about what it means to be Latino in this moment. And Robin, in our work, what we do is we often center our understanding of the current moment through understanding the historical trajectory that we've been in this country. Right? You can't really say that you fully understand what we're experiencing now if you completely divorce the current moment from that historical trajectory, because it tells us a whole lot about why we are here. Right? And obviously, this whole country's relationship to Latinos is one that I feel is not settled into a full relationship of trust and seeing us as full citizens. It seems like our citizenship is always in question, regardless of how many generations we may be here. You know, as you know, originally the way in which Latinos became part of the United States was not us crossing the border, but the border crossing us, right? I mean, which is again, it's an interesting. Again, you want to talk about immigration, you want to talk about Latinos in the U.S. You can't talk about that reality without acknowledging that moment. We did not cross the border crossed us with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and how the United States, purchased, right, so much of what used to be Mexico, basically the whole western side, southwestern side of the United States. And those individuals that now all of a sudden overnight find themselves in the territory of the United States are given a choice: become a US citizen or stay a Mexican citizen. But if you stay a Mexican citizen, you're only going to be able to stay here for so long. You're going to have to move back to Mexico. I thought I was in Mexico, by the way, right? But those individuals that stayed and decided, yeah, I'm going to claim U.S. citizenship, they were given reassurances that their property and their land and anything else would actually not be taken away from them. Well, guess what happened? It was taken away from them. Their citizenship was always in question. Their loyalty was always in question, right? So that's what starts this whole process. Then we have this relationship through agriculture to Mexican workers who work the agricultural fields, which is an interesting thing because I think for the most part of the history of the United States, the people that have worked the fields have always been of Mexican descent. So very, very shortly, maybe obviously during the time of slavery, you had, but not white folks, right? Um, very few white folks had actually worked the land because it was their land. But for the most part, again, who has really worked on the fields has been Mexican folks through agreements between the U.S. government and the government of Mexico that allowed for that movement of Mexican migrants to come into the United States to work on the fields seasonally, and then they would move back. Well, some of them didn't. Some of them stayed, right? But it's been an established practice for decades, for most of the history of this country, right? But it's always been sort of that sort of we want you here because it serves a purpose. But the moment we don't need you, we will kick you out. A very disposable relationship, which actually, as you also know, did happen a couple of times in the 1930s and the 1950s. The operation in the 1950s was given this wonderful name, Operation Wetback
Mm.
was the official name of the deportation effort, which, by the way, Trump has mentioned several times as an aspiration of what should happen today, which I think he has modeled his current deportation process under that model, right? For those of you that are not aware what happened in those two times, 1930s and 1950s, we deported about 1 million people of Mexican descent. Many of them, by the way, were U.S. citizens. And yet we deported them nonetheless. And to this day, there has been no legislation introduced in Congress to compensate those individuals that lost jobs, property, businesses, none. Right? It took a long time to pass a law that provided some level of compensation for Japanese individuals that were put in internment camps, but it never has even brought up to the floor of Congress to consider the reality of those individuals, U.S. citizens of Mexican descent, that were deported on those two deportation efforts in the 1930s and the 1950s. So again, that idea of deportation is not new. The way in which people talk about why that deportation effort was needed, if you look back at those two times, both in the 1930s and the 1950s, look at the newspapers and what they were reporting that leaders were saying about why it was needed. The language is almost verbatim to the language that we are hearing today. The drug dealers, the rapists, the crime-ridden communities that need to be removed from this country. No different. So that rhetoric is not new. So in other words, I feel that us as Latinos, we are always second-class citizens. We are always questioned in terms of our loyalty to this country, even though how many of us have fought in the U.S. wars, including up to now, right? Folks that are not yet citizens, but yet they felt compelled enough to actually put their bodies in front of uh, armed situations, armed conflicts, putting a U.S. uniform on because they felt that that was their duty because they live here. And the moment they get back to this country, they get deported. Uh, After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, also many signs that would show up in businesses across the country, particularly in the South. No Mexicans, no dogs allowed, no blacks. We talk about the history of lynchings that impacted African Americans. Mexican Americans were also lynched, not at the same level, but they were also lynched. That was another similarity, if you will, in terms of treatment. So there seems to be a well-established relationship of disposability, of lack of trust for all our ability to be full citizens. I mean, look, we just had this, show during the Super Bowl, right? Halftime show with um, Bad
Bad
Bunny.
Bunny.
Bad Bunny, right? And people were losing their minds, right? The whole show in Spanish, it made people lose their minds, right? Many people not realizing, we just need Americans to actually do the halftime show. Well, guess what, folks? Puerto Ricans are Americans. Okay, so you just lost a little bit of that lesson in your history lesson about how Puerto Rico is part of the United States. So you see someone like him and you say, "Oh, that is not a U.S. citizen. That is not an American." Well, okay, your ignorance is just going to really show in a pretty bad way. But again, the theme overall becomes we Latinos in this country, even though we were here before the U.S. was the U.S., right? We are not worthy of being seen as full citizens, worthy of having the title of being Americans. So, as you know, Robin, my experience is a little lighter, but it shows up in all kinds of ways, right? One of the ways in which my experience being here and feeling that sense of maybe I don't fully belong here has always been around my name.
Mm.
Jorge Ceballos, and immediately folks will turn Jorge into George. And it happens every day, right? That I go somewhere and my name shows up, people immediately go to George, right? And I it's been a battle, it's an ongoing battle, and Some of you know this, some of you in the audience know this. For 8 years of my life, I went by George Zebelos, right? Because I felt like I didn't want to have to deal with the sense of rejection that I felt every time I had to introduce my name and spend 5 minutes just to get people to say my name right. It's not that hard, folks. But anyway, that's the experience, right? But it wasn't just like, oh, I have to get you to say it right. But every time I said my name, there was also this expression that I would always get that was just like, I am so annoyed at having to deal with this, your name and your presence, right? Your accent, you know? So George Zebelos was an easy way to avoid any of that nonsense. It took me 8 years to realize I am losing my sense of identity because George Zebelos is certainly not me. It doesn't sound like me. It doesn't reflect me in any way. I had to reclaim my name and go back to Jorge Ceballos. Where I basically land in all this, Robin, is just this moment reminds me once again how little so much of this country thinks of us and our ability to claim full citizenship in this country. That's how it is.
So, Jorge, I'd like to ask you just a couple of questions, and thank you for thank you for sharing your reflections. I think it's obvious that one of the things that you might recommend to people who want to be allies to you and people who are Latino is to know your history,
Mm-hmm.
right? You can't understand what's going on if you don't understand the treaties, the annexation of land. Who were the people that were living in what is now California and
Mm-hmm.
Texas and the southwestern United States? What happened to them? Well, and as you pointed out, they were Mexican citizens that instantly either became Mexican citizens that had to leave or American citizens who often lost their title to land and the like, among many, many other important historical facts. But here we are in 2026 at a really remarkable moment in terms of the federal government using Latinos as a foil,
Mm-hmm.
in my estimation. That is, we need to get rid of them because if we get rid of them, crime will go down and you all will have no inflation and lots of jobs. A lie,
Right,
obviously.
right.
And so, what would you like your allies to do, particularly the people who are not of Latino origin,
Mm-hmm.
but feel disempowered or don't have any idea of what they might do to help the situation so that folks like Liam don't get detained and so that we don't find ourselves in the future going after Latinos or for that matter anyone else, any other group of people simply because of the way they look or the way they speak.
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate the question. Um, and as you mentioned early in your question, I think for certain one of the first things is to understand the history of Latinos in connection to the United States, right? So, I mentioned the way in which the border crossed us uh, back at the time of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the annexation of so much of the Mexican land to the United States. But that's a critical moment, and I think too many people still don't know that reality, right? The only way in which most people, I think they understand the presence of Latinos in the United States is the idea of us crossing the border, the southern border between Mexico and the United States, right? And that's certainly in contemporary times uh, one of the ways in which that presence has increased in the United States. But it did not start there, right? It really started, actually even started before, during the colonial time. And you know this because of the presentation that I created many years ago, to look at that part of the history of the presence of Spaniards in Latin America. That when the Spaniards were able to gain control of what is known today as Mexico, they expanded their colonial territory into what is now the United States, all the way into the northern part of the United States, right? So the Dakotas, for example, the colonial empire of Spain, its territory encompassed even those regions of what is known now as the United States, right? So you can't you can't understand the current moment in that relationship without understanding that that presence was there way before the United States was even a thought. So then also, in more contemporary times, if you will, when you think about the crossing of the border, the other thing that folks need to understand is that at least at some point, I haven't looked more recently, so maybe might be a bit outdated, but certainly at some point, not that long ago, 50% of the people that overstay their visas and are now here undocumented did not cross the border, came by plane. Came by plane with originally a legal visa to be able to enter the country, right? So the idea of closing the border, that's going to, it's like, well, you still have another 50% that are going to come initially in a legal way, and they're going to end up staying anyway, right? So what is that going to really do, right? So just let's not just have knee-jerk reactions without understanding fully the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, and I'll stop there because as you can see, I can go on for a while. Because the other thing is, understand that so much of the migration of particularly certain countries, Nicaragua, Guatemala, those migrations came as a result of U.S. intervention in the politics of those countries. That all of a sudden create internal dispossession, that folks feel that the only way in which I'm able to actually feed my family is to find ways to get into the United States to be able to earn enough money to feed my family. So folks are not coming just because they want to be in the United States. This idea that so many folks will say this, oh, people come here because of our freedom. Disabuse yourself of that nonsense notion, right? People come here because they need money to eat. And if they feel that coming to the United States is going to be able to do that, they'll come here. But if they're able to make money home, they'll stay home, people. People don't leave just because they think the United States is a much better place. It's because the conditions in their country are such that it leaves them no option. And oftentimes those conditions are created by policies of the United States in those countries.
Mm-hmm.
So learn the history of Latinos, particularly the history that connects to the reality of our presidency in the United States.
Yeah, thank you for that. Anything else that you think would be important for people who are allies in addition to, getting get that education? And we will put some reference material, some easy reading, if you will, so folks can get some baseline knowledge. There are some good books that talk about the Latino history of the United States, if you will, and the presence of Latinos before the United States became the United States. But what about now? What about today? What are some of the things that folks can do to help the situation, do you think?
Yeah. So a couple of other things I'm thinking about, and you mentioned this, Robin, in your introduction. Um, the the violation of immigration law is not a criminal violation; it's a civil violation. You won't hear that from this administration. They actually like you to think and believe that it's a criminal violation, but it isn't. Right. So learn about the difference, right? Because many of you might fall prey to that idea because you hear it so often, and often uncontested, by the way. Unfortunately, the media just doesn't know enough either often to be able to challenge that, so they just leave it as a true statement. So learn the difference: immigration violation is not a criminal violation, it's a civil violation.
Yeah, and more specifically, as I mentioned, if you come here on a visa and overstay, it's a civil violation. If you actually enter the country without the right process, it is a misdemeanor, which means it's a extremely low level crime, um,
Right.
not the kind of offense for which there are usually criminal penalties, certainly not incarceration. So, the
Mhm.
idea that coming to the country makes you a criminal is very much overinflated.
Absolutely. Then connected to that, right? Because notice that there is a very clear intentional way in which this administration tries to attach the word criminal to our community. We're criminal, as you said, by violating immigration laws. Not true. We come here, and so many of us are drug dealers. We rape people. We kill people. So it seems like the majority of us coming into this country are criminals. 100% not true. As a matter of fact, even I believe the Cato Institute, right wing conservative think tank, has documented the idea that Latino immigrants commit less crime than the U.S. population. Right? So again, the attachment it is a very intentional thing, and if it goes uncontested, then it seems like it sticks with some folks. Oh, Latinos are criminals. So yeah, I mean, look, I love Latinos, but if they're coming here to commit crimes and kill our people and rape our women, no, I don't want them here. That is absolutely not true. A very small number will actually fall under that category, right? But as you know, Robin, and you and I have talked about this forever in terms of particularly speaking about the white community. Um, you know, you can't claim yourself to be an ally if you are not in relationship with us. You can't do it from a distance. That is not allyship. That's performative allyship. I'll sign a petition. I'll go to the protest. How many Latinos do you know? I don't know any. Well, then that's it, right? You actually need to be in authentic, trusting relationships with many members of the Latino community because it is through that relationship that you will get to fully understand who we are and what we contribute to this country. So, you know, you have to be in relationship. You can't be an ally to any group. I don't care which group you're talking about. From a distance, you can't do
Thank you for that, Jorge.
it.
One of the things that strikes me about this, of course, I'm not Latino, is how this obviously means horrible things, deportations for people feeling that you might be deported or especially scrutinized simply because of who you are. Made even worse by a recent report that the administration has subpoenaed social media agencies like Google and asked them to report on any websites that either track or criticize ICE, right? Right? Track or criticize ICE. That means you say something bad about ICE, the government wants to know who you are
Mhm.
and what you said. And of course, what that means in the larger picture is who knows who can be next.
Right? Absolutely.
Today, Latinos are the ones who are the big boogeyman. Let's build a huge army like apparatus to get rid of them and terrorize cities. But we know that the history of despotism means that they don't stop once it gets going. It's like once you have your handle on the first set of enemies, you move on to the next set of enemies. Whoever,
Mhm.
and we know that there are plenty of potential enemies for people who simply believe that hate stereotypes and bigotry should rule. I think that we all pay a price for remaining silent in the face of oppression and evil, right? It
Mhm.
can feel like it doesn't affect us, and maybe sometimes we might be lucky and it won't, but it doesn't mean that it won't pull us down, right?
Mhm.
We pay a price for not adhering to our best values because our society is really based, if you think about it, on some fundamental ideas, the ideas that the framers had about equality and fairness and compassion toward people who were strangers,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Compassion toward people who were strangers. Now, I'm not in any way trying to blow smoke and say that we've lived up to those values all of the time, but we've got a responsibility, especially in times where our discourse is so coarse, so mean, so nasty, so full of name calling, that we have to turn that around because it's those guardrails that have made our country the place that is not only the economic powerhouse, but used to be a moral center for the world to look at. How is it that we treat each other? How is it that we treat other countries? Right? How is it that we can live in a world without destroying one another? Those fundamental existential questions come down to how each of us ultimately exercises our moral course as we move forward. And I think that you're right. This is an important time for us to begin to exercise those. So I really, really thank you for this share.
Thank you. Thank you for being in conversation with me about this topic and such a personal thing. So again, thank you. Thank you for being there.
And so that concludes our episode. We'd like to thank you for being here with us on this episode. In the comments section, we'll leave information that might be useful for those of you that want to learn a little bit more about the history. And of course, please like and subscribe. It really helps us. So, for Jorge Zabayos, this is Robin Parker saying thank you for watching and see you next time.
Take care, everyone.